began working on a sermon earlier in the week and then changed it. And looks like that was maybe somewhat fortuitous because I changed it to a prophetic theme centering some thoughts around the Middle East. And I got up this morning, and of course, there was the coordinated attack from the United Kingdom and France and the United States in retaliation for the chemical use of weapons by Syria. I don't have a lot of the details on that, of course, because it just took place, but that centered our attention once again on the Middle East, although has anybody's attention really ever gotten off the Middle East? There's a lot going on in world news, of course, at this particular time in history. The age in which we live, which is so very unique compared to about 5,900 years of man's history. China's increased in military might, certainly gaining the attention of the Western nations, and they are very strong militarily, or getting stronger all the time, and of course economically, an absolute powerhouse. Many feel like the dominant power of this coming century. Talk of the trade war that may or may not develop, we'll see. Of course, there's the conflict between the U.S. Support of Taiwan and Russia, and China and their claim to Taiwan. North Korea nuclear weapons have been in the news, but they may be backing down a little bit because of threats to them, and as well as maybe China's intervention there. Europe is just changing, and many feel like it's more dominantly almost Muslim now than it is Christian. Many just claim that Christianity is no longer the default religion in Europe. And although everybody isn't Muslim, how many people actually attend a Christian church has so dramatically declined in Europe that that religion probably is the more dominant one. Had written down here in my notes Syrian chemical warfare, and then woke up to what we did here today in the U.S. retaliation, of course, Iraq and terrorism and that constant problem, and many of the unpredictable comments that you don't know what the Pope is going to say next as well. He's certainly a unique character in that way. But there's always the present Middle East and its conflict and its tension and its turmoil that always seems to be there. The Imam of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, now you have the Dome of the Rock, which many feel is right in the location of the original temple, but still on the Temple Mount is this Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that's used regularly. I don't know that they let anybody in the Dome of the Rock very much at all, certainly not too many tourists. But that Imam heading up that mosque stated that any normalization of ties with Israel is a sin. So you know that there's not going to be much change in the view of many, at least Palestinians, towards Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, no surprise, reiterates his country's intention of denying nuclear weapons to their enemies, regardless of what it takes. So if something looks like it's clearly going to be a nuclear threat, then you can look for Israel to react to that. And then what's that going to bring? Nobody really knows. Nations realize the Mideast conflict could escalate beyond the region. You could wake up one morning just like we did to the news today, and the world begins to change and never goes back because of one precipitation like World War I, how that began. Well, why do we look at the Middle East for prophetic fulfillment? Who cares about the Middle East? Why do we look at that? From where does that come in the Bible? Where do we get all of that? Why not Australian prophecy? Or why don't we look closely at Ireland? Or maybe Japan? And certainly we could throw in China, Russia, India. Look at all the people there, and they're growing economically. Ireland, Japan, Russia, India, Texas. Why don't we throw Texas in there? So why do we look to the Middle East? From where does that come from in the Bible? Well, we'll review a little bit of that here this afternoon. Now, let me give a brief look at modern history of where we are. I know it's not something that we're totally without understanding of, but sometimes forget all of this. The modern history of the Middle East and what's going on there, because it does tie into the whole story. The Turkish Ottoman Empire ruled the Middle East for about 400 years up until the time of World War I. They were obviously the dominant power and controlled that whole area. Now, this happened to be right before World War I, or during World War I, was the setting for the movie Lawrence of Arabia, one of the best movies of all time. When you think of the cinematography and the acting and the storyline, but that's the story of T.E. Lawrence, thus Lawrence of Arabia. He was a British Army lieutenant, and he was leading a kind of a coalition of these Arab tribes against the Ottoman Empire, and I think they attacked Aqaba and Damascus, and it's the whole story of how Lawrence gathers these people together and works with them, and it's quite an interesting story, but a true one, in at least fundamentally in what was taking place. Of course, the Arabs felt very much betrayed after World War I by the British and the French, because they felt like they didn't fulfill their promises, that if they would help them and aid them, which Lawrence helped them to do, and that's another story. But after the war, many new nations were formed after World War I, out of the Ottoman Empire. You had new nations. And all of this came from France and Britain as victors, and they worked through the League of Nations at that time. So you had Iraq, you had Lebanon, Kuwait, Syria, Transjordan, modern Turkey. Egypt became an independent nation in 1922. All of this now is what we have fundamentally today in the Middle East. And of course, these nations, then these new nations, were bickering among one another on and off, but all of that magnified and became much more intense and much more bitter, you might say, when Israel declared itself a state in 1948. Now, in 1917, right there at the time of World War I, the British made a statement called the Balfour Declaration that the Jewish people had a right to a homeland in Palestine or the Middle East or Israel. They had a right to a homeland. And in 1948, Israel decided, well, we're not just saying, okay, we have a right to live here. We're a state. We're a nation. We're the nation of Israel. Well, the nations around went ballistic with that declaration. Immediate war. That started it off. So that is the present set of circumstances, you might say, and a little bit of the background to it. Israel declares it's a nation. It's not going anywhere. It's not doing anything. Many of the Arabs feel like, yes, you are. You're on our property. You're on our land. We were double-crossed by the British, and we're not accepting this. That's a very, very sketchy, very basic background. Now, the Bible indicated that the Jewish people would return to their homeland. There's an indication of that. And in 1917, when it was declared that they had a right to a homeland, that was actually about 2,520 years from their initial captivity by the Babylonians. That's the house of Judah. Their initial captivity in 604 BC, 2,520 years later, is 1917. Now, 2,520 is 7 prophetic times. That's 360 days for one time or year times 7. And that comes into play in prophecy in a number of different ways. So just very interesting. The church, I don't think, tries to just pinpoint something exact on that, but it's interesting that a period of time. Now look at Zechariah chapter 12, verse 2 and 3. It would seem as though there had to be something in some manner for there to be an Israel as a state prior to the return of Christ, which, of course, the Jews were scattered everywhere, throughout Europe, the United States, elsewhere, Russia. Now they have their own country. They declared themselves a country in 1948 and had a homeland approved of by the British after World War I. So Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 2, Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people around about, when they shall be in a siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. In that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. So Jerusalem will become a focal point, that area of the world, a center of attention. We'll see more about that here in just a little bit. Now, some people do claim, some churches or theologians claim, Israel's return to the promised land fulfilled millennial prophecies. But they really did not. That's not really the prophecies of establishing Israel in the millennial reign of Christ. Look at Jeremiah 33, verse 16. So Israel did get a homeland. It seemed as though that was necessary to fulfill prophecy of the end time, but that did not fulfill all of the prophecies about coming out of a captivity and then being established when Christ sets up the millennial reign. Jeremiah 33:16, in those days, that's the end time when Christ returns, in those days shall Judah be saved, and Jerusalem shall dwell safely. It's really not the case at this point. They're not all that safe. Well, there's some military protection, but they're not feeling like we're safe. You feel threatened. And this is the name wherewith she shall be called the Lord our righteousness. So there's coming a time when there will be an establishment, a return from a captivity, an establishment of both Judah and Israel, and there will be the peace. And that will be when Christ reigns during the millennium. But some unfortunate things are going to take place before that comes about. Well, as I mentioned, since 1948, Israel has been the center of conflict. They've had some very close calls. You had the initial fighting in 1948. Then you had the Six-Day War in 1967. I went on the dig from college in 1970, and the Six-Day War was very much on the minds of the Israelis, I suppose the Arabs as well. You saw army personnel walking around, especially the more important sites, and they had their machine guns, and there was all the awareness that war could break out any time because they had come through the Six-Day War just a few years earlier. So it was fresh on everyone's mind, and after the Six-Day War, Israel gained territory. They extended their boundaries because they were attacked, and they took it over, which only created more animosity because now they have more land that they took. Well, then came the Yom Kippur War of 1973, and that was much more serious. The Israelis, you recall, were very much taken by surprise. Here, the Day of Atonement, and President Sadat and Syria coordinated an attack on Israel, surprised them, made advancement, looked very threatening. But the Israelis pushed back, and because it's all history, they regained the Sinai and regained the Golan Heights that they had temporarily lost some of it. And then that war came to an end. I think Russia intervened, the United States, and called a truce to it, but that was even more so. And of course, all these various skirmishes and terrorists and things that have taken place since that time. But the enemies have not prevailed. But the Middle East animosity goes back to Jacob and Esau. And the church has walked us through that on different occasions. We've gone through that in the Bible study on Genesis not that long ago, selling of the birthright, and how some things have seemed to have come all the way down in history and still prevail between two different peoples. Israel today has made treaties with Jordan and with Egypt, but not with Palestinians, not with other Arab nations at this time. Daniel chapter 11, verse 40. We ask the question, well, why do we look at the Middle East? Who said to do that? From where does that come? Well, here's just a few highlights here. Daniel chapter 11, verse 40. And at the time of the end. So we're coming near the time of Christ's return, which is the central theme of the Bible and Bible prophecy and the millennial reign of Christ. So at the time of the end, the king of the south will push at him, the king of the north, two primary players at this particular time, dominant players, shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen, with many ships. He'll enter into the country, shall overflow and pass over, and shall enter into the glorious land, which most everybody interprets as the Holy Land, Palestine, Israel, the Middle East there. So they'll enter into that, so that it'll be, again, a reason for attention. There's a reason they're going there. Why do they care about going there? Well, maybe other scriptures will tell us. Let's go back to Zechariah 14. Zechariah 14. some major players will obviously be involved and will involve themselves in the Middle East. Zechariah 14:2, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. The city shall be taken. Why are they going there? What's going on in Jerusalem? Jerusalem's not that powerful a city. It's not a New York, a Moscow, or a Beijing. Why there? Well, there's a number of reasons. Of course, the three major religions are a part of that, how they look to Jerusalem. The city will be taken, houses rifled, women ravished. Half the city shall go forth into captivity. The residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. So no, we haven't arrived at a time when they will dwell safely. Judah will dwell safely, and Jerusalem will be at peace. We haven't come to that yet. That's when Christ returns. We've got to go through a tribulation period, a time of trouble, which the world has never seen. We ought to be thankful for the time of peace that we have. We'll read something a little bit later that shows that won't always be the case. So those are some tidbits you might say of, well, why do we look at the Middle East? Who cares about that? From where does it come from? Well, certain prophecies seem to center on that area and events that will take place in and around Jerusalem. Now, another factor in looking to the Middle East and to Israel has to do with the idea of possibly rebuilding a temple and worship being restored. We know there was Solomon's temple, that, wonder of the world that Solomon built. David was not permitted to do it, but Solomon built it, and it was a marvel, of course, but that was destroyed by the Babylonians when they invaded Judah. The house of Judah, as I mentioned, began in 604. 2,520 years before 1917. So Solomon's temple, and that was destroyed. Then we know there was the second temple. That was the one of Ezra and Nehemiah, and the time of Haggai the prophet, and Zechariah, and Zerubbabel. And so, of course, many people complain, well, this thing is so far inferior, we're ashamed of it. God said, well, don't be ashamed of that. I'm with you the same way I was with them. So there's the temple of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's the temple that was around when Jesus was a boy and then went into his ministry. Herod the Great had refurbished it so that it became much more beautiful in Jesus' day, but it was the same temple, a reconstructed temple after the original temple of Solomon was destroyed. Now in Daniel chapter 7, let's go there. And again, we're breaking in on some things. We had the Bible study on Daniel and Revelation, which meant basically verse by verse. So I'm not building all of this back up for us, just highlighting a couple things. Daniel chapter 7, and he sees this vision, and he sees these beasts, and then the fourth beast, and horns coming out of that fourth beast. In verse 8 of chapter 7, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were three of the first horns plucked up by the roots. Behold, in his horn were the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So you have these revivals of this fourth beast, the Roman Empire, and then there's this other horn, kind of a government that looks like, almost like the Roman government, but it's a religious entity. Let's come on down to verse 21. He says, and I beheld the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them until the Ancient of Days came. And judgment was given unto the saints of the Most High. The time came, the saints possessed the kingdom. You see how it comes all the way down to Christ's return, the time of the end. Here's this same horn. He's making war against the saints. Saints are sometimes Israel, physical Israel, and sometimes the church. And thus he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth. So it gives a definition of some of those comments there. Let's go to chapter 8. Now, this chapter 8 goes into the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire is taken over by the Macedonian Empire and by Alexander the Great and his father before him. And after Alexander's death, his kingdom, the Macedonian Empire, was divided into 4 of his generals in different parts of the empire. So now we're going to pick up one part of that four-part division. And the story thread goes through that one individual and is not concerned with the other three. So Daniel 8 and verse 9, out of one of these four came forth a little horn which waxed exceedingly great towards the south and towards the east and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and to cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yes, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary cast down. So there's this fulfillment, and there's also kind of a dual fulfillment to come later. And a host was given him, verse 12, against the daily sacrifice by reason of the transgression, cast down the truth to the ground, and practiced and prospered. One of the saints I heard speaking to another saint and said unto him, well, how long is all of this going to take place? For the vision concerning the sacrifice, the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot, he said, unto 2,300 days, then it'll be cleansed. So most everybody interprets this as being fulfilled by this Antiochus Epiphanes, where he actually did go into the Holy Land and stop the sacrificing that the Jews were doing, and I think offered swine's blood on the altar and just made it spiritually desolate in that way. And so it's speaking of him, but it's a type of something that apparently will take place at a future time, when a religious power along with a civil ruler will have some dominance. Verse 23 of Daniel chapter 8. In the latter time, so it follows this one individual through the Roman Empire and coming down to the time of the end. In verse 23, now in the latter time of their kingdom, all the way near now to the time of Christ's return, when the transgressors are come to the full, some kind of a king, some great political leader, some charismatic, special individual with fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand out. There's some kind of a power that the individual seems to have. He's a human. There's something strange. His power shall be mighty, but it's not his own power. Well, whose power is it? Not God. It's going to be some other evil power, demonic power. He shall destroy wonderfully and shall prosper, and practice shall destroy mighty in the holy people. So some kind of connection with this political leader, with a religious leader. There's going to be persecution for the nation of Israel, perhaps the spiritual nation, Christians at the same time. And finally in Daniel chapter 12, where we know Daniel is talking here in chapter 12 about the very end, verse 11, and from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, the abomination that makes desolate set up, there's 1,290 days. So it seems like it may be that Antiochus, he stopped the sacrifices for 1,150 days, according to earlier in Daniel. But the next time, it seems to indicate it'll be for 1,290 days, so maybe a little different period. But here again, right at the return of Christ, is some kind of sacrificing, and they're stopped. There's some kind of abomination. That's what Jesus said in Matthew 24:15. I'll read that to you. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel, stand in the holy place. So there's some reason to look to whether there's going to be a physical construction of an edifice and a full temple. There appears to be the need for sacrificing of some kind of resumption of religious practice that has not been taking place for centuries, for that to resume, for then someone to come along, this end-time leader and religious leader, and put a stop to that and set up, as Jesus said, an abomination of desolation and disrespect all of that. So once again, it looks like the Holy Land, the Middle East, that's going to be the focal point course, the major three religions. So different threads and different themes center us back to the Middle East, which is, again, as I mentioned before, why we tend to look at that as opposed to Australia or China or Japan, and though they'll have a role, I'm sure, not in the same way that things seem to focus on the Middle East. So we can't predict everything that takes place, or what does this morning mean? Don't really know. Been so many things that take place. But at some point and someday it'll thrust us into end-time events. Well, why can't man find peace in the Middle East, or anywhere for that matter? We know it's going to be a center of attention. We know a lot of things are going to transpire even up to the return of Christ, and a battle of Armageddon, right in that very area of the world, right, as Christ returns to Jerusalem. But why can't man find peace in the Middle East or anywhere else for that matter? That's an important question that we're to have the answer for. Israel, of course, on the surface, it's easy. Israel said, we're not leaving. We set up our nation. This is the nation of Israel. This is our ancient land. We've been here now, how many, 60, 70 years, or whatever it is, and we're not leaving. We've built up this nation. We're not going anywhere. And, of course, many of the neighbors say, that's unacceptable. That was ours. We got double-crossed. You came in, just declared yourself in our territory. And they feel like to accept that it would be disrespectful and shameful, and they're not going to do it. So who's going to negotiate a peace when you have two sides that have that posture? And of course, nobody's been able to solve that. And it doesn't seem like it can be solved or will be solved, obviously, until Christ returns. But what's the basic problem? I have 3 points to tie into this theme here today that are important to us. Number one of the main problems is that no one can make a judgment. There's no one to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And here's the reason, and here's the decision, and we're going to abide by this. There's no recognized authority in the world. No one recognized authority. There are major players, but no one great world-ruling king. Isaiah 32, verse 1. I have Isaiah 32, 1. Notice what we learn about the millennium. Isaiah 32, 1 says, behold, a king shall reign in righteousness. The Bible doesn't reveal, we don't need anybody. We don't need any kings. We don't need anybody that has responsibility or authority. We've gotten rid of all of that. We all have God's Spirit, and we're all just even, and we all get along, and nobody needs to. That's not the structure. It's not what God establishes. Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness. Princes shall rule in judgment. Yeah, there'll be a king. There'll be decisions. There'll be judgment. And people will abide by that. They'll trust it. They'll have trust in that judgment. Verse 16, then judgment shall dwell in the wilderness. Righteousness remain in the fruitful field. So there'll be a king. There'll be authority. There'll be leaders. Somebody will be able to say, okay, I've heard of both sides. I've gotten consultation, gotten counsel. This is what we're going to do. And then the parties abide by that. There's nobody to do that today. Some great leader will come on the scene and try to at least gather certain nations and wield authority, but there's no one king. So there must be, we understand that in the church, there must be government in the home. And that's in 1 Corinthians. The husband's the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the husband, and God is the head of Christ. There's just government in the home. There's government in the church. There's government in any nation. Government in the millennium. There'll be government in the kingdom of God. When everybody's spirit. Still be government. God's still going to be on a throne. He's not going to step down. He'll be everybody's buddy. In that same way, will always be Almighty God on his throne. Well, seeing the breakdown of our own government is sad. And I think we all see that. And I'm not trying to bash, our country. It's just the reality of what it is. The respect for the president, for the Congress, the Supreme Court, the justice system, the FBI. We know it's at an all-time low, isn't it? These, what used to be fundamental pillars, solid institutions. The Supreme Court, now that's all political. It's 5-4, 4-5. Who's going to get appointed? Who's not going to get appointed? Which way it's going to swing? It's like the whole country's going one way or the other based on 5-4. Politicized. Of course, now the FBI's had, a black eye, and people always respect the FBI, and it used to be the president, and all of these things. It's sad to see that our government, it just doesn't carry the same respect and honor that it used to be in so many different ways, kind of an all-time low. Point number 2, why don't we have this? Well, we don't have a leader. We're learning principles of government. We're going to be a part of that. We're going to be meting out judgments. Another one is that there's no forgiveness now. Judy and I, a couple weeks ago, and the DeHarts joined us, went to a movie up there in Conroe, and the movie was titled, I Can Only Imagine. Imagine some of you have seen this or heard about it. It's based on the story behind the band Mercy Me. It's a Christian band. And the movie is based on the story of that band and their lead singer and their famous song of that title, I Can Only Imagine. And it's the most played Christian song ever on Christian radio. No song has ever been played more. That's how popular this one song is. And the movie was about how this song come about. Where did we get that? And it's really a very good story overall. It's a story about the lead singer and his relationship with his abusive father. Dennis Quaid's the abusive father in this movie. So, and he was very abusive emotionally as well as physically. And it's about the singer and his experience that way. And the movie has a very strong message of forgiveness in it. That really culminates near the end of it. And the change that it brings in this lead singer, the son who had been abused, the change that came over him when he finally was able to come to a sense of forgiving his father for the way that he treated him, which was harsh and very emotionally and psychologically harmful. But he finally came to a forgiveness, and then the change that it produced in him, which resulted in the song, this famous song. And of course, he was asked about that song, and they said, well, how long did it take you to write that song, and the words, and put down the music? He said, 10 minutes. Well, it took me 10 minutes to write it down. It was quick, it was easy. And the one person interviewing said, no, that didn't take you 10 minutes, it took you all your life. And I said, well, that's true. It was a whole life and contemplating all of these things. And once it came together, and once there was this forgiveness, well, he knew what he wanted to write, and the music was there in his head. It took me 10 minutes, just came right out. But it took a lifetime to be able to write it, of course. So it was quite an interesting story. I can recommend it. Sure, there are going to be some, kind of mainstream Christian themes or thoughts or comments and so on, but I don't think it ruins the fundamental message of it, and you'll learn about where that famous song came from, and it's some good music as well, and good drama in the story. So we enjoyed it. But let's go to Colossians 3:13, because that is certainly a part of what we see in the world scene today, a sense of a lack of forgiveness, and we're learning that. We're learning government. We learned why there needs to be government. We're learning to govern. And we also learn forgiveness because Colossians 3:13, forbearing one another, forgiving one another, if any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do you. So we have to do that too. We have to learn that part of it. And a lot of people in the millennium, the second resurrection, are going to have to experience that. And I think you can think and imagine that. Of course, in the second resurrection, God or Christ are going to say, well, we could have left you there in the dirt. Could have just left you, but I forgave you. I gave you life. I'm forgiving you. What do you think you need to do? Probably an incentive there. Well, point number 3, What's the matter with the world, Middle East, society? What do we know about this? How could we teach anybody anything? Well, I think we realize that what's needed is a new heart. Ezekiel 36:25. Ezekiel 36:25. Then will I sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean. From all your filthiness, from all your idols, I'll clean you. Once again, the millennium. A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. I'll take away the stony heart out of your flesh, give you a heart of flesh. And I'll put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you shall keep my judgments and do them. When you get this new spirit, you will think differently. You will feel differently. You will look at people differently. And it may not come overnight. It's not automatic for any of us, but a new spirit. And when you have that spirit, you think differently and look differently to other people. And that's definitely needed. You don't see a lot of that Spirit of God today. All of these points and others, whether it's the government, whether it's forgiveness, whether it's God's Spirit, those are things we learn. How are we ever going to rule anybody? How are we going to make judgments? We're learning about those. And we only have an earnest of the Spirit. When we get the full payment, we'll be advanced, I'm sure, from where we are now. Well, we live in interesting times. I'll read this to you as we begin to wrap up. This was just today that I read it anyway, here this morning. Stumbled on it. This is written by a Billy Hallowell. The Bible is more than clear in its theological claim that Jesus Christ will return to earth at an undisclosed future time. In fact, that belief is a central hallmark of the Christian faith, that Christ will come back. Almost all Christians believe that. And the latter point about the timing is essential to highlight, as Scripture makes it clear that no one knows exactly when the so-called second coming will unfold. Yet once again, here we are with some people setting a specific date. April 23rd, 2018. That's the newest date for the purported fulfillment of certain prophetic signs or events. That's the latest one. The date setting all seems quite bizarre, considering that the Bible repeatedly and clearly speaks to our inability to know exactly when end-time events are. And we got into a little bit of that, I think, decades ago in the church, where things seemed to add up. But as we got closer, we realized, well, that wasn't coming about. I never picked a specific day that I recall. But I was in college in 1972, around that period of time. We just went to class. Nobody did anything any different. By that time, we knew it didn't look like those things were coming together in the same way. But no matter how many times these predictions fall, some people are still bent on advancing strange and unbiblical eschatological theories. You might recall Christian leader Harold Camping, who made international headlines in 2011 for twice predicting that the world would end and getting it wrong both times. In the days and the weeks leading up to the dates he set, some of his followers were so convinced he was right that they sold their homes and spent their savings helping spread the message that judgment would soon be upon us. Well, I've known people in the church to do that. People in our church. I don't mean Caldwell, Houston North. I mean, in Worldwide Church, I've known people to go off after 2 or 3 different individuals based on prophetic interpretations that individual supposedly had, sold homes, gave all their money up because such and such was going to happen at a particular time. It was rather strange, some of it, and went off to different states and out west. And, of course, those dates came and went, and I think several of the leaders that purported that, they've died and aren't living any longer. So this is not necessarily just all these other deceived people. Well, they were deceived in that case, but they at least had some connection with the truth and the Bible, and off they went with their interpretation. So he says, so that brings us back to April 23rd, a date that has been sparked some chatter. The Express, this is a publication, has more about what some end-time enthusiasts are proclaiming. According to conspiracy theorists, codes in the Bible suggest the end of the world is imminent, with Earth set to be destroyed on April 23rd. You see, if you know the code, if you can get that code out of Revelation, you know April 23rd is the date. One theory suggests the end time dates back to astrological constellations appearing on November 23rd, matching the book of Revelation, chapter 12, 1 and 2. It's right there in Revelation, chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. This is pretty similar to what was prophesied last year before September 23rd, when some said that the alignment of the stars, the sun, and the moon pointed to the coming series of prophetic events. And there were also some strange theories involving Planet X, a purported planet that NASA says doesn't exist, but that some people believe could somehow destroy Earth. That was September 23rd. I got a letter from somebody in one of the prisons that I'd corresponded with, or was new, I think. I might have shown Mr. DeHart this too, in which he was saying, well, what does your church say about September 23rd? This is before that. I said, they're not saying anything about it. Or what do you say? Or what is your church? We're not saying anything about it. It's September 23rd. It's the day before the 24th. It's about all I know we're saying about it. Well, you've got this alignment of the stars that's never been in the history before. There's never been that alignment in the same way with the stars and so on, and tying this in with that. And of course I wrote and said, don't put any faith in all of that. We don't look to that by any means. Since Revelation 12 discusses a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and crown of the 12 stars on her head, a connection was made between what is described in Revelation and what was slated to happen in the skies. And on April 23rd, since the sun, moon, and Jupiter will be in Virgo, there's once again speculation that something biblical could be afoot. On what basis, you ask? Beats me. History shows again and again that these predictions are always wrong. Well, there's another one. Look out for the 23rd is coming now. And I suppose that will go on as long as there's, a speculation about some of these things. Yes, there will be signs. The Bible says there are signs. It's not some secret code in counting the letters and the words. There will be signs, and Jesus said, when you see these, you'll know something. It doesn't say look up to the signs and calculate through astrology or the planets and their orbit and their position, and that's a code. Nothing like that. That's more pagan worship, and which we're warned against. Looking to the constellations. So there's no hidden meaning that way. We look to His Word, His Spirit. We heard that in the sermonette. We look to God's Word. We look to His Spirit to guide us. Jesus never gave some instruction to His disciples. Here's what I want you to do when you see Jupiter and the sun and they're in Virgo and then so on. Didn't tell us to try to find answers that way. So what's coming in the Middle East as we just contemplate once again things that are written in the Scriptures. What's coming in the Middle East? Well, nobody likes to really try to interpret some event and go right to a Scripture and apply that in a specific way. We're more careful about that. There is coming Jerusalem Day, May 13th. Maybe that'll mean something, maybe not. President Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and that infuriated a number of people. So there are massive demonstrations planned for May 14th. And May 14th happens to be the 70th anniversary of the statehood of Israel. Well, 70 is a unique number. Does that mean something? Might just mean it's one less than 71. Nobody knows. So there are some things, there's some demonstrations planned that can always break into violence. Violence can create terrorism. That can create a reaction. You never know. Remember what happened in World War I? Firing of one shot with the Archduke. And that Ferdinand, that began World War I. So at some point, I think response to perhaps Islamic extremism will result in a powerful politician coming on the scene. perhaps in the European area and theater, and a religious leader maybe saying we're going to get back to what we used to be and our heritage and our roots and the church, not be taken over by a different religion. So you never know exactly how that will come about and how quickly. And then things be centering attention in the Holy Land, like we read. So all of that is yet to be fulfilled, but according to the Scriptures, it's true. Let's look at one or two more verses and conclude in Luke chapter 21. We don't know all of the details of how things will transpire. Luke chapter 21, Jesus is making comments here about his return. Well, we won't go through basically the Olivet prophecy and what's going to take place. Well, verse 12, before these things they shall lay their hands on you, persecute you, deliver you up to the synagogues, into the prisons, being brought before kings, rulers, for my name's sake. I mentioned earlier that we live very much at peace. We're not threatened by anyone, have wonderful freedoms. At some point, God's people, before Christ returns, it's going to be more perilous, at least according to this, at least for some people in some areas, delivering them up, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. It shall turn to you for a testimony. Settle it therefore in your hearts not to meditate before what you shall answer. So God will have to be with us on that occasion. I'll give you a mouth and wisdom which your adversary shall not be able to gainsay nor resist. But you're going to be betrayed because of what you stand for. There's going to be some point you have to stand for what it is that you believe. What is the truth? And then you're going to be hated in verse 17 for my name's sake. And that can be Israel, the descendants of God's people, or spiritual as well. There shall not a hair of your head perish ultimately. Nobody can take your eternal life. That's the most important thing. In your patience, possess you your life, your patience. Because everybody will want Christ to return and put an end to it, and it'll seem to delay. So in your patience, and the patience in trials in this life. Patience is a critical component of God's Spirit and our way of life. And then what I read earlier about the armies around Jerusalem. So what it tells us, doesn't give specific answers to what's going on today in the news. We have a sketch and an outline, but these things tell us about the spiritual dimension and the qualities about God's people. We're going to have to be a people of faith. We know what we stand for. We know who we belong to. We know what we represent. We stand on that. That's what our life is about. That's who we are. That's what these people are called upon to do. We're going to be isolated in some respects. We have to have patience. It won't be over overnight. Things will drag on, may not be very pleasant. We have to have that spirit of patience, which is a fruit of the Spirit, and we're going to have courage. This will not be an easy time. We're not called upon on a great deal of courage, perhaps, at least collectively at this time, but there'll be a time when that will be the case. So here's just a little look once again. Why do we look to the Middle East? Well, for some of these reasons, but most importantly, we look to God, we look to His truth, and we look to His Spirit and ask Him for the things that we need, and we continue to go forward as we now enter in another time after the beginning of God's holy days.